Direction, is it insufficient? As our next guest notes in a recent piece, Venezuela has suffered for 20 years under socialist policies that have caused shortages, hyperinflation, and crime, forcing millions to flee the country. Let's get the perspective of Daniel Martino, who is a former student and author who was a resident of Venezuela. He fled the country in 2016. He's tweeting at Daniel Martino, the piece I just referenced in the nationalinterest.org on the website, What Venezuela's Interim President Must Do. Daniel, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Tim. Thank you for having me.
Why did you leave Venezuela?
Venezuela has been under socialism for as long as I've lived. Chavez has been president since Chavez was elected president, in fact, 1 month before I was born. And the reality is that every year that I lived in Venezuela until I finished high school, it was harder to get the goods in supermarkets. I hated going to the supermarket with my mom, and my mom everyone hated going to the supermarket because you had to stay in line for hours. You had to be marked with your fingerprint in a scanner so that they could tell you what you could buy. It is living in an authoritarian regime, communist authoritarian regime. So I had to leave because I wanted to be able to raise a family. I wanted to be able to buy my own home. I wanted to be able to afford food, and that wasn't possible in Venezuela.
Daniel, was there a time when things were a little better because the money was rolling in as a result of Venezuela's oil production? At one time, it seemed that the country was flush with cash. What happened to it?
Well, Venezuela was definitely much better every year prior. Every year just gets worse, right? But the reality is that even since the late 2000s, perhaps by about 2008, we started seeing shortages of different goods. I remember even when I was a child that there were months in which you couldn't find milk in the supermarkets. Then it was toilet paper. And then as the government just increased its control over the economy, it was everything. So inflation, even in Venezuela during the 2000s, was over 20%, then over 30%, and now we're seeing over 1,000,000%. So even during our best years during the Chavez era since the 1999, we had inflation higher than the United States has ever had in its history.
How different is Nicolas Maduro from Chavez?
Well, the difference is that Chavez was a charismatic leader. He was much more authoritarian. He had the power more in his control. Now Maduro has to deal with many internal factions who are just fighting for money inside the government, and that might be the thing that ultimately dooms him. But we don't really know what's going on inside their corrupt circles.
We have seen millions of people, estimates 3-4 million people have left Venezuela in the last year or two as a result of the Maduro regime and the hardships they're living under. The question is whether or not Mr. Guaidó is going to be a solution. Is Juan Guaidó, is he accepted as a possible leader? And if so, is the United States support of him the right thing to do?
Well, we do have data on this, Tim, actually. The latest poll that came out from the only independent poller that's left in Venezuela, called Mega Analysis, puts Guaidó's approval rating and support recognition as president at 90% of the population, while Maduro has less than 5%. That is a stark contrast, and that it just tells you that there is a widespread consensus in the Venezuelan population that Guaidó is the president, and that Maduro is just a dictator that is occupying power illegitimately. Now, even the Brookings Institution made an estimate, and you can play with their tool, that shows you, according to different variables such as the oil price, remittances that people send, how many more immigrants we could see out of Venezuela, how many more refugees. And the reality is very, very, very sad. It could be that we have 10 million Venezuelans leave the country within the next few years. And that would make it one of the largest refugee crises in history. It would be even larger than the Syrian crisis by the end of this year.
Do your friends tell you, Daniel, that the United States should do more? Are they even thinking about the possibility of U.S. troops? Because it seems now that Nicolas Maduro only has the support of the military, and that's, of course, key. But should the U.S. be more forceful in its involvement?
Yes, I do think the U.S. and all other countries should be more forceful in their involvement. Right now, the actions that were taken yesterday by the Department of the Treasury were excellent. widely supported. They are going to stop all oil imports and exports of gasoline to Venezuela immediately, and then some transactions are going to wind down until July. And this is very important because the state oil company PDVSA has been basically looted by the corrupt allies of Maduro. They took everything they could. They wanted to take even more. Now they wanted to take all the gold that was left in different banks around the world, and thankfully England stopped that as well, and the United States did. Now, what the United States can do now, that is the question. It depends on what Maduro does next. If Maduro doesn't let the humanitarian aid that is coming, together with Brazil and Colombia, the United States should, in fact, intervene in Venezuela. But this should only happen at the request of Guaido, of course, which I think that he's definitely leaving the door open. If you saw his interview yesterday with CNN in Spanish, and we'll get even more information tonight with his interview in Fox Business, he said he has never ruled out an international intervention, which is something very new. And at the same time, he's been in continuous contact with the presidents of Colombia, Brazil, and the United States.
All to watch, and we will do so. I do appreciate your perspective, Daniel. Thank you for joining us on POTUS today.